Greetings, everyone. I'm Phil Norris, candidate for Alabama's 4th Congressional District, and I'm continuing the series, The 28 Key Principles of Freedom, that were talked about in this book, The 5,000-Year Leap, A Miracle That Changed the World. Today, I'd like to address the second key principle of those 28 key principles that makes our society free, and that second principle is a free people cannot survive under a Republican Constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. A virtuous and morally strong people was absolutely critical in the foundation of our government. And Ben Franklin was talking about that only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. There was some debate or some concern back in the early days of the colonial days that we did not have the moral and virtuous traits in order to live as a free people, and the republicanism ideas. Republicanism simply means that the ability to be self-governed. And so you can imagine if you have established rules in a society that you have to have a reasonable expectation that everyone is committed to obeying those rules, and when they do, you have a chance of living in a peaceful society. And so there was some concern back in the colonial days, because there was so much fighting and so much strife and just general chaos in the colonial days, because they're trying to break ties with England, trying to establish our identity as a nation. And George Washington got involved in this debate, and he was talking about the U.S. Constitution, and he later praised it as the palladium of human rights, but pointed out that it can only survive so long as there shall remain any virtue in the body of the people. And so we're talking about a virtuous people. We talk about morality and virtue in individuals all the time. Like we talk about the 10 Commandments in the Bible, and we talk about God's laws and how we should obey those laws for those of us that espouse those laws and believe in the Creator and have a relationship with God. And the public virtue was somewhat different than that. And so what they were concerned about was not only the individual morality for people that were church-going people and religious people, but they were worried about our general morality as a nation, what we call the public virtue. And so the public virtue goes beyond individual virtue, and it basically says that in a free people, there comes a point where sometimes you have to put aside your personal gain and do something that is virtuous in relation to the overall common good of the people. In other words, you make laws that affect the overall good of the society, and you have to be able to support those as a virtuous people and recognize their benefit to the overall good of mankind in your society. And so it's not challenging your personal virtue, but it is adding to the public virtue. And so that is essentially how they define public virtue. Now, back in the colonial days, there were some self-doubts about this, as I described earlier. Remember, the English people had come here seeking the New World and religious freedom and a number of freedoms, and they still had some of that old world British mindset in them. And so they were all about comfort, and George Washington, there were some people that were kind of doubters, and those people were John Jay and Robert Morris, Robert Livingston, and even John Dickinson. But it diminished over time because of people like John Adams and George Washington, Richard Henry Lee, and Josiah Quincy kind of had proven them wrong in their doubts. Because of their patriotic nature, they realized that, hey, maybe we can make this thing work. Now, I'd like to tell a quick story about George Washington to give you some idea about a virtuous and moral people, and how that his selection as the first president of the United States has been claimed by many scholars as being a divine intervention, that God hand-selected George Washington to be the founder of our nation and our first president. Now, the story goes George Washington was in the colonial army. He was still a British subject. And there was an uprising around modern day Fort Duquesne or around in the Monongahela River Basin. And it's close to modern day Pittsburgh, I would say. And so he took 1,300 of the finest British soldiers out. And there was an uprising with the French and the Indians were trying to overrun and take that property. So George Washington decided, his leaders decided they needed to go squelch that uprising. So he takes 1,300 British soldiers with him into battle. And he was an officer. He was a smaller officer, probably a captain in the British Army. And so they get in on their way to do battle. They were ambushed by the Indians and the French. And so it's chaos right away, and there's bullets flying. And it came down to one point where George Washington was the only officer still left riding a horse. Most of the officers were wounded or killed, and he was the only one left standing. And he had many horses shot out from under him in battle from this ambush. And so he had decided they were down to about 300. They had lost almost 1,000 soldiers, so they had about 300 soldiers left. So he decided it was time to retreat. So he retreated back to Maryland, and when he got home, he wrote a letter to his family, and he said, "I can't believe it." I'm paraphrasing what he said. "I can't believe it, but I found 4 bullet holes in my jacket from that battle." Years later, there was an entourage that was going back to pay homage to that battle, and General Washington was a general now, and so he was going to lead some people there, and they were going to pay respect to the dead there and pay homage to that battle. And so the former Indian chief, the Indian chief that had opposed him in that battle, found out that George Washington was coming back to the battle site, and he tried to arrange a meeting with General Washington, and the meeting was scheduled. And so when General Washington gets to the meeting with the Indian chief that had opposed him in that battle, the Indian chief told him this. He said, "General Washington, I don't know if you know this or not, but I personally shot at you 17 times. And when I realized I couldn't kill you, I instructed all my braves to stop shooting at you because you were protected by the Great Spirit." And out of that story, it become critically known that it was obvious that George Washington was appointed by God to lead our nation because he was a moral and virtuous person. And so that story kind of shores up this concept of having a virtuous and moral people. Now, some of the things that Americans were corrupted by back then, which gave doubts to our virtuous society, having been living in England, because a lot of English people at that time, all they wanted was luxury, indolence, amusement, and pleasure. And so Thomas Paine wrote about this in his pamphlet called Common Sense. He talked about that he didn't think Americans, the new Americans here, had really fallen prey to that. I would call it materialism, modern day materialism. And so he said the Americans didn't seem to be subject to the same persuasions as in the British homeland. So he thought there would be some hope for this new nation. And then there was a self-examination period for a while. And a lot of newspapers wrote, anywhere from New York to Boston to Philadelphia, even down to Charleston, there's a lot of escapades that were written about. It kind of had given some self-doubt to whether or not we can be a virtuous people and succeed in an experiment of self-government or republicanism. So we go forward and we look at some of the leaders that really came forward and talked about what was going on at that time. It says, young James Madison gloried in the atmosphere of national purpose, saying that a spirit of liberty and patriotism animates all degrees and denominations of men. It was in this climate of reform and commitment that Americans saw themselves sublimating and improving their social consciousness to the point where the continuing presence of British manners did indeed seem to be a threat to the new reform. And a guy named Gordon Wood relates this. He says, by 1776, it had become increasingly evident that if they were to remain the kind of people they wanted to be, they must become free of Britain. The calls for independence thus took on a tone of imperativeness. Only separating from the British monarch and instituting republicanism, it seemed, could realize the social image the Enlightenment had drawn of them. So they were trying to get rid of the British influence and thereby have, instead of an aristocratic mindset, to have a mindset of self-government. And all this related to one of the key principles was the fact that people were able to own property in the New World. And that property ownership gave them a whole new perspective on a virtuous and moral society, because property was important, and the fact that they had the freedoms to do that, they wanted to protect that right. So they would try to instill a government that would ensure that they could maintain their property. And so that required a virtuous and moral people. Like if I have something, Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlets, if you go out and start a society, you take 5 people, and they eventually decide, hey, you have something that I want, and so you have to have laws in place to make sure those 5 people don't try to take each other's property. And so that was the same thing that was going on in America. So if you own property, you wanted to make sure you had laws to protect your property, and you wanted to be able to respect other people's property as well. So we go through and we look at being a virtuous society. Thomas Jefferson said that virtue is not hereditary. It has to be earned and it has to be learned. Neither is virtue a permanent quality in human nature. It has to be cultivated continually and exercised from hour to hour and from day to day. The founders looked to the home, the school, and the churches to fuel the fires of virtue from generation to generation. And George Washington wrote in his farewell address, he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. And so the next concept we'll talk about is virtuous leaders. And so we have to have religion in order to have morality, and those leaders have to practice religion. And so does the general society. So we go on and we talk about some of the warnings from the founders in relation to public virtue. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, Samuel Adams, who is sometimes called the father of the Revolution, wrote this to Richard Henry Lee. He said, I thank God that I have lived to see my country independent and free. She may long enjoy her independence and freedom if she will. It depends on her virtue. And John Adams pointed out why the future of the United States depended upon the level of virtue and morality. And he said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So we've looked in our days in modern day experiments of governments in different situations. If you don't have a moral people, your laws that you instill in a government are going to be negligible. They're going to be insignificant because they don't embrace the laws. The sum of all is, this is Samuel Adams, if we would most truly enjoy the gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people, then shall we both deserve and enjoy it. While on the other hand, if we are universally vicious and debauched in our manners, though the form of our Constitution carries the face of the most exalted freedom, we shall in reality be the most abject slaves. So it is absolutely imperative that we become virtuous people through the practice of our religion. And the key concepts that are innate with the world religions, especially the world religions at the time that our nation was founded. And so that is key to us surviving as a nation, to have a moral and virtuous people. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Phil Norris. I'm running for the Alabama 4th Congressional District. I hope you consider voting for me on March 1st, and I approve this message. Thank you.